Okay.
Okay. Should I spell your name, Ian?
Yeah, Ian.
Ian.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there a clicker for this? Or? Because if not, I have one. I have one here.
Okay. Okay. Good morning. Welcome to SMERU Institute. Thank you for your coming here. Today we have Professor Ian Coxhead from University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is the chair of the Department of Agriculture and Applied Economics there. He will presenting his newest research about Indonesian, I think, about Indonesian economic growth and poverty from the perspective of labor markets. So we will have 2 hours of discussions, 40 minutes for presentation and 80 minutes for discussions. Okay.
Sure.
Okay. Without for further details, so I leave the floors for Professor Ian.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for coming. Thank you for allowing me to take up some of your time today. Since I don't know most of you, and most of you don't know me, apart from some who have long history, let me say a few words about myself. I'm an economist who specializes in economic development in Southeast Asia, and most of my work historically has been in the Philippines and Vietnam and Thailand. But in the last few years, maybe 5 or 6 years, I've been working increasingly on Indonesian data. You notice I don't say working in Indonesia, but hopefully that will come. My experience of Indonesia so far is mostly as a user of data. That's what you're going to see today. And so knowing the reputation of SMERU, I wanted to bring some work that I've been doing to you and learn from you today. So that's my goal, and I welcome all of your comments and suggestions and evaluations of this work. It's relatively new work, and I think it's an important subject. I also think that I have a lot more learning to do before I can be very confident about what I say. So if you want to interrupt with questions or comments, please go ahead and do so. I'll be happy to field those as they come up. So my training was in trade and development, and you know that trade and globalization are very important subjects in Southeast Asia, especially so in a country like Indonesia, which has financed its economic development by selling natural resources primarily to the rest of the world, and then using those resource revenues to finance industrialization, education, infrastructure, and all of the other things that a modern state requires. And Indonesia's record, of course, is fantastic. Really, it's an unbelievable transformation from, in our lifetimes, from, say, the 1960s to the present, seeing how Indonesia has grown from a country which was widely dismissed by experts as incapable of development 40 years ago to one which is really a model of development in many respects today. Not least political development. The democratization of Indonesia is a fantastic phenomenon, and I'm very delighted to witness that at work this week. So I'm trained in trade and development, but the critical connection between trade or globalization and economic welfare is, of course, the ways in which a globalization shock or a trade shock affects the productivity and the return to labor. Labor is the most important factor of production. Labor is the most important source of income, especially for the poor. And so what happens to the labor market is really a critical factor determining how widely the gains from globalization or trade shocks are spread within the economy. That is, what effect they have on poverty and what effect they have on the distribution of income, two very big issues for the Indonesian economy today. And we know that long-term development is all about transforming an economy from a condition of dependence on natural resources, agriculture and mining and forestry and fisheries, to one in which the main source of economic activity is based on reproducible factors of production, that is, investments in physical capital and human capital and the network capital that makes all of that productive. And Indonesia, as you know, is in the middle of that transformation somewhere, still very heavily dependent on natural resources, but also working very hard to make the transformation to an economy where human capital and networks are really the dominant sources of income and productivity growth. So it's a very interesting time to ask how well Indonesia is doing by looking through the lens of the labor market in particular. And that's what this piece of work is about. So the title is a little bit provocative because it contains the word boom, but it also contains the phrase adverse labor market trends. And I want to juxtapose those two things. Since the end of the Asian financial crisis, let's say since 2001 or 2002 in Indonesia, in the last decade or more, the Indonesian economy has grown very well, but at the same time there have been some contradictory trends in the labor market, and I want to focus on those and ask what they are and perhaps what they mean. So that's where I want to go today. Okay, so a quick overview of what I'll talk about. I'll begin by telling you things that you already know, so I'll be quick about the recent growth experience of Indonesia. No need to waste your time with those things. I'll then do a more detailed analysis of the labor market in Indonesia, and particularly of some kinds of structural change that we see taking place in that labor market during the last decade or so. I'll do some analysis of that using earnings equations, and then I'll draw some conclusions from that. Then I'll look at some other possible stories that we might tell that might also be consistent with my tale about the Indonesian labor market, and then I'll tell you a little bit about where I think this research could productively be continued in terms of new directions. Okay, so things that you already know. Indonesia's growth experience has, of course, been fantastic, with only a couple of setbacks. You know those setbacks. So these data go from 1961 up to 2011. The blue line is Indonesia's per capita income as a percentage of the world average. So back in the 1960s, 5, 6, 7% of the world average, now about 20%. That's a really phenomenal transformation, as you know, for the Indonesian economy. And with the exception of the Asian crisis years, this has been achieved by sustaining a rate of per capita GDP growth, which has really been very consistent and also very high by developing country standards, and even by the standards of by the more rigorous standards of East and Southeast Asia. So the only, of course, the only dip is the very severe and prolonged crisis that came with the Asian financial crisis, and we'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment too. So accompanying that growth, we know that poverty has declined, and again, the accomplishments of the Indonesian economy there have been really spectacular as well. So you know these data better than I do, that poverty starting from the dollar a day measure starting from somewhere around 20% of the population in the mid-80s down to a very low number now. All of the other indicators of poverty are correlated with that. And so we're now in a situation in Indonesia where it appears that many of the most severe forms of poverty either have been overcome or can be overcome with more effort. And again, that's a fantastic transformation for an economy which only 2 generations ago was really thought incapable of solving the problem of poverty and food security. This is really a marvelous accomplishment. But then we also know some things that are a little more troubling. One of those is that in the past decade, inequality in Indonesia has risen very fast. Historically, as you know, Indonesia was well known for very low, very stable Gini coefficient, somewhere around 0.32, 0.33. Now it's up into the mid-4s somewhere. And we want to know just where that's coming from and what it might mean for the economy. And we also know that while poverty has gone down and incomes have gone up, incomes remain very tightly clustered around the national poverty line, so that small changes in income can have very big changes in terms of the number of households that move above or below a head count measure of poverty. And then finally, we know that the drivers of economic growth in the 2000s have been several. Primarily, I think, a resource-fueled export boom, mainly exports to China of minerals, forestry products, and so on, which has created a lot of income growth, but also a lot of Dutch disease. And I don't think I have to explain to anyone in Indonesia what Dutch disease is, right? So we'll just keep going. There are 2 other things that I think are potentially important. One of these is the lingering effects of the Asian financial crisis. In particular, a very long, slow, and low recovery of investment after the crash during the late 1990s and the beginning of the 2000s. So it's really only about 2006, 2007 before investment as a share of GDP recovers the rate that it had achieved in the pre-crisis years of the late 1990s. And it could be that that's had a very long, drawn-out effect on the capacity of the economy for growth, and especially the economy's capacity for transformation away from natural resources towards industry and certain kinds of industry in particular. And then finally, there have been some mixed trends in Indonesian economic policy over the last decade. And again, you know this much better than I do. We know that labor market policies have been tightened at various points. Minimum wage laws, especially those devolved down to local level. New laws or tightened regulations on hiring and firing, things that reduce the flexibility of the labor market. And Indonesia's international record on labor market flexibility is not very good. We also know that fuel subsidies have become an enormous drain on the economy, and especially on the fiscal resources of the government, which means that there's been crowding out of other kinds of development policy initiatives, especially education, infrastructure, health, and other things related directly to human welfare. And then we also know that there's been a lot of instability on the front of trade policy and FDI policy as well, much of which has, I think, had the effect of discouraging investor confidence in Indonesia, and may also have slowed down the economy's potential for transformation over the last decade. So there are lots of things going on in the Indonesian economy, some positive, some not so clearly positive, and some clearly negative. And I think one of the goals of any researcher seeking to understand long-term prospects for welfare change and poverty decline, one of their primary tasks is to disentangle all of these different influences on the economy and see which ones are really dominant and what can be done about them from a policy perspective. So that's what you already know about the Indonesian economy. The inequality story, of course, the Gini coefficient climbing from the low 30s up to the somewhere in the mid 40s over the last decade or more since the Asian crisis. the clustering of poverty around the national poverty line. So we see that although the number of poor at the national poverty line has diminished a lot in the last 5 or 6 years, we also know that if we look in the region of the poverty line, that is, if we look at those who are 1.5 or 2 times the poverty line in terms of income, then we're accounting for quickly a majority of the population. So that clustering of household income around the poverty line says that the accomplishment of declining poverty in the last few years is not necessarily a robust one. If economic growth turns down, then poverty could quickly rise in Indonesia. That's an issue, I think, a policy issue. And then we know that the effects of the export boom, and in particular the Dutch disease effects of the export boom, have had a big structural effect on the economy. These are data on the real exchange rate, that is the exchange rate of tradables for non-tradables, or rather non-tradables for tradables in the economy, and we know that that real exchange rate has appreciated quite a bit during the 2000s. That's an indication of changes in domestic relative prices that favor non-tradable industries, service industries, housing, construction, and so on, and personal services relative to tradable industries, especially agriculture and industry. And that's going to be an important part of the story that I want to tell you today. That's going to be some of the macroeconomic background. Because the story I want to tell about the labor market is one in which the demand for labor is changing by sector and implicitly by occupation, and is therefore having an effect on the incentives for young Indonesians to stay in school. And I'll develop that story in just a moment. But how does that change in demand for labor come about? Well, the growth of the economy means, of course, that consumer demand for non-traded services, housing, health, education, domestic tourism, local transport and trade, all of these kinds of things has grown very quickly, much faster than income itself. And of course, the rising real exchange rate means that the competitiveness of Indonesia's tradable industries, especially its manufacturing, has not increased and in fact has arguably decreased relative to trading partners over this time. So one of the things that we know is that the contribution of manufacturing or industry generally to the growth of the Indonesian economy has diminished quite a lot in the post-crisis era. These are data that summarize that. The blue component of each column here is the growth of services or its contribution to GDP growth. The red is the contribution of agriculture, and the green is the contribution of industry, including manufacturing. If we look back at the pre-crisis years, then industry growth was the dominant force in the growth of the economy. It accounted for most of GDP growth by sector. If we look at the post-crisis years, then we find that the dominant sector contributing to GDP growth is now services. Now, services is very heterogeneous, right? Services is lawyers and accountants and government, and it's also people selling minor products, making small things, doing local transport, doing local trade and services of that kind. So it's very heterogeneous. We can't look at services and say that's a dynamic sector or not a dynamic sector. It's very mixed. But we do know that the most dynamic sector in terms of technology and demand for skills is manufacturing, and that the growth of manufacturing has not been very healthy in Indonesia in the last decade, either by Indonesia's own standards or by the standards of other countries in this region. Yeah.
That's the number between the brackets, 3.3.
Oh yes, I'm sorry. So the first of those two numbers is the average growth rate pre-crisis, and the second is the average growth rate post-crisis. So services post-crisis growing at 3% per year, industry growing at just a little less than 2% per year. Should have said that. Thank you. Yeah. So you can see here very clearly the decline in the contribution of industry, including manufacturing, to overall GDP growth. From 4%, maybe 2/3 of growth, down to 2%, maybe 40% of growth in the post-crisis years. We can see these those kinds of data a little more clearly in these numbers here. If we look at the growth of output and employment by sector in the pre-crisis and the post-crisis era, then we see pretty clearly that the tradable industries in the economy have diminished in relative growth rate, relative importance. So if we look at manufacturing and construction in the pre-crisis years, 1990 to 96, up here, they were the fastest growing sectors of the economy. Manufacturing in particular, growing very, very fast indeed. Construction, because we had the pre-crisis boom in asset price bubble and boom in construction as well. We can see that right there. But when we look at the post-crisis years, or at least the majority of the post-crisis years for which we have good data, we see that the biggest fall in growth rate has been in manufacturing and in construction in here. And we see that all of the tradable industries in general have done rather poorly. So now that the biggest growth rates are all pretty much concentrated in non-traded industries, wholesale trade and transport and other service-related activities here. So a big change in the structure of production in the Indonesian economy, which of course we see in the demand side GDP figures as a large rise in the share of consumption in GDP, up to the high 60% range now. Okay, so the economy is changing shape in the post-crisis years, and the way it's changing shape is that non-traded and service sector-oriented activities are growing much faster than traded and especially manufacturing activities. And that's reflected in the growth of employment. If the overall growth of employment in the post-crisis years is about 1.7% per year, then we can see that the majority of the growth in that employment is again taking place in the essentially non-traded services components of the economy, in construction, transport, and other service sector activities, whereas the traditional tradable sectors, agriculture and manufacturing, are contributing very, very little to overall employment growth. And this, I think, is a source of some concern. We expect agriculture to decline in relative terms as the economy expands, but we don't expect manufacturing to decline, or at least not at the rate that it has been declining in relative terms over the last decade in Indonesia. So what does this mean? I want to begin by looking at the change in the structure of labor demand, and then I want to turn attention to the incentives that that creates for young Indonesians who are considering whether to stay at school or join the labor force, or to go from middle school, high school, or high school to college rather than join the labor force, because I think there we see signs of very adverse labor market and very worrying labor market trends. So what's happening in Indonesian labor markets? Well, we know that there's been a boom in resource exports for the last decade or so. We have China and to a lesser extent India to thank for that. And we know that that's created a Dutch disease effect in which the growth of income from resource sectors has really imposed a tax of a kind on the tradable sectors, and especially on manufacturing, so that we get growth in non-tradables, relative decline of tradables, and especially manufacturing. We know that there's been some policy tightening. I talked about that already. And we know that as a result of labor market changes in particular, the cost of labor, that is, the cost to producers, has been rising, even though real wages have not. So real earnings for wage earners in Indonesia have not risen a great deal. In fact, for most Indonesians, have not risen at all in a decade, at the same time as real labor costs have risen, and that, I think, helps us to understand very slow growth of employment and very fast growth of youth unemployment in Indonesia a decade after the Asian financial crisis. But what I really want to focus on now is the changing composition of employment, especially for younger workers, new entrants to the Indonesian labor market. And I want to focus on this at a sectoral level, and I also want to address it at the level of employment type, especially the trend towards informal employment, or rather the slowing trend away from informal employment. What does informal employment mean? Well, you can define that by enterprise. We can say your job is with an enterprise that's not registered, doesn't pay taxes, doesn't have licenses. Or we can say, we can define it by employment and say your job is an insecure job. You don't have a contract, you don't have benefits, you don't have a formal employment arrangement. So these are two among several possible definitions of informality. But the key point is that informal employment, as you all know already, is something which is not especially desirable for the majority of people who find themselves in this situation. Some people select informal employment because they're entrepreneurial and they see that as the best way to go ahead. But for the majority of workers, informal employment is something you do because you can't get a formal sector job. You want a factory job, but you end up selling minor services, doing motorcycle taxi work or something like that, or construction instead. So I want to focus on these two kinds of change in the labor market. Change in the sectoral distribution and change in the type of employment experienced by workers. So I'm going to use the data from the IFLS. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. Is that correct, Asep? Should I assume that? The Indonesian Family Life Survey. So you know that there have been 4 rounds of this survey. The round that I'm going to focus on today is the 2007 round, but we'll also draw some data from 1997, the pre-crisis round of the survey as well. And these are data from 3 rounds, 97, 2000, and 2007, and they show us, for the IFLS survey, which is nationally representative, they show us the changing structure of employment in the labor force overall. So when we look at this, the first column is, the first 3 columns are agriculture. There's been very little change, just a little bit of a decline in the 2000s in the percentage of the labor force employed in agriculture, down from about 35% to the low 30s. Not much change really for the whole labor force. We can see that in the other big industries, that is in manufacturing and 2 kinds of services, we see a small amount of decline in the share of labor force in manufacturing, from around about 16% to about 13%, and then moderate increases in the share of the labor force in the major kinds of blue-collar or unskilled service industries, especially the wholesale, retail, hotel, restaurant, personal services category in here. So there have been changes in the structure of employment, small increases in non-tradable sectors, as we would expect in an economy experiencing resource-driven export growth and Dutch disease. Small changes, small declines in tradable sectors, especially manufacturing. Same thing, we expect to see that, but overall the changes are not really great. Not much evidence of structural change. That's because there's not much churning in the Indonesian labor market. That is, most people who get a job in one sector tend to stay in that sector all their working career. That's the typical case. But where we see change is when we look at the composition of employment by sector for new entrants to the labor force. So now we're comparing the youngest cohort of workers, those under 21, in each of the 3 years. For agriculture, we see from 97 to 2007, not really much obvious change, but where we see big changes is in jobs taken by new entrants to the labor force in manufacturing and in services. And here we see that for young Indonesians, school leavers going into their first jobs, in 1997, about a quarter of them got jobs in manufacturing. That's gone down to about 17%. And in 97, around about 20%, 1/5 of them going into wholesale retail, hotels, restaurants. Now that's gone up to maybe 26 or 27%, and a corresponding rise in some of the personal services categories here. So if you're a young Indonesian in 2007, and you're looking at what will the labor market offer me in terms of a job, then compared with 1997, pre-crisis, by 2007, the highest probability outside of agriculture is that you're going to be working in one of these service sectors here. Okay? Previously, we would have said there was a very high probability, 1/4, that you'll be working in manufacturing, but that probability has diminished a great deal as manufacturing's growth has not kept pace with the growth of the economy. So at this extensive margin, that is, For young workers, new entrants to the labor force, we see signs of tremendous change in the structure of employment in the Indonesian economy. So far, so good?
Yes.
Okay, carry on. Okay, why do I focus on this particular comparison? Well, it's because we know that within the economy, which are the industries which really have technological dynamism? Which are the industries which reward skills? They are primarily manufacturing, okay? Which are the industries outside of agriculture that tend to be very heterogeneous and have a long left tail in terms of returns to skills, primarily services? So you can see where the story is going to go, right? As the composition of labor demand for new entrants to the labor force changes, we see declining growth in demand for skill-intensive activities and rising growth in demand for low-skill intensive activities. That's where the story is heading. Okay, that's the sectoral story. Now I want to think a little bit about, I'll just skip this, think a little bit about informality as well. We know that in the labor market, informality of employment is usually a response to some kind of market failure or some kind of restrictive policy. It may be that there are some entrepreneurs who prefer informal sector activity because it does give them room to grow, right? They're unfettered by licensing and taxes and things like that. But the typical case is that most firms and most workers prefer formality rather than informality because of security, because of access to credit for the employer or the producer, and because of secure employment and benefits for the worker. And usually when we see very high rates of informality in production and in employment, it's a sign that something's not going right. Actually, there was a column this morning in the Jakarta Post from Danny Roderick, the development economist now at Princeton, who talks about exactly this. And he refers to Mexico. Mexico is also the subject of this study by Gordon Hansen at University of California, San Diego. And in these cases, they look at the Mexican economy since the so-called tequila crisis, the economic financial crisis of 94-95, and they find that formal sector activity in Mexico has not kept pace with the growth of the overall economy, so that for both employers and employees, informality has become far more widespread. Job insecurity is much greater. Capital intensity and therefore potential for productivity growth is much lower. The really big fact that Roderick points out in this morning's article is that when you divide industry in Mexico between large companies and small companies, the small ones are mostly informal, you find the total factor productivity growth in large firms about 5% per year. And that in small firms is about minus 5% per year. So that tells us that the informal sector is not a dynamic part of the economy, whether we define it by firms or by employment.
That imply also like a small, medium enterprise.
Now, small and medium enterprises may be formal or informal, right? Yeah. So that's kind of a gray area. Roderick's story this morning just divides it into big firms and small. Doesn't address that important area, but it's an important one. Yeah. Yeah. I think the critical thing is if you're a formal enterprise, then you have a better chance of access to credit from the banking system. If you can access credit, you can invest at a reasonable rate and acquire new productive machinery, pay your workers better, hire better workers, give them benefits and job security. All of those things follow. So it's really the dividing line should be formality or informality. Okay, so we know that informal employment is associated with lower wages, less security, less favorable conditions for employment. And we know this even though we don't agree on the definition of formality. We can define it by employment status, and that's the way that one study of recent labor market trends in Indonesia has gone. By employment status and enterprise characteristics, or we can define it just by employment status alone. And I'm going to use the second definition, and here's why. In the first one, that is the one in this study by Newhouse and Suryadharma, they define informality by a combination of enterprise characteristics and employment types. And when they do that, they come up with about 2/3 of the economy in formal employment and formal status. That's much, much higher than the data for corresponding developing countries. Countries like Mexico, South Africa, Thailand, Vietnam, Philippines, any place you name, the level of formality as measured is usually much, much lower than that. So we define formality just by employment status. In the IFLS data, we say if you have a job that has a contract or benefits, that's formal employment. If you don't, that's informal. And when we use that definition, we come up with about 1/4 of the labor force in formal employment, 3/4 in informal employment, and that's right in the middle of the range for other countries. So that's our preferred measure of informality, but we don't know for sure. Maybe the truth is somewhere between 1/4 and 2/3. Don't know. Okay.
Do you mean that 2/3 are formal?
Yes, 2/3 are formal in the Newhouse Surya Dharma definition.
Not the other way around.
2/3 are formal. Yeah, they have a very high rate of formality. Here are the data. So if you look at Newhouse Surya Dharma, then they come up. These are the formal employment numbers that they produce for different sectors, and their overall number 0.67. So 2/3 of the labor force in formal employment by their definition. I think it's too high. Yeah. Should be the other way around. Right. So the numbers that we use rely only on a more conservative definition of formality, and with those numbers we come up with about 1/4, 27% in formal employment and all the rest in informal employment. So I'm going to focus on those numbers. And of course we know that informality is especially high in service sector activities in here. It's also quite high in manufacturing, but mostly in services. And that's the area where most of the most of the labor demand growth has been taking place in Indonesia. Okay, I mentioned that wages are not rising that fast. I think what I really want to focus on here is the changing ratio of formal to informal wages in Indonesia. So the blue line up the top here is average wages from 2001 up to 2010 for formal employees, regular workers in this terminology. The green line down here is the average wage for casual workers. These are both inflation adjusted or cost of living adjusted, so they're real wages, and they're pretty much flat, both of them, right? But there are small variations, and those small variations mean that the ratio of formal to informal has been rising over time. So that the ratio here is the ratio of informal to formal, as you can see, has been falling not steadily, but over time it's fallen to a much lower level than before. So that if you're a worker in the Indonesian economy and you have formal employment, then on average your real wage has risen just a little bit. Of course, there's a lot of variation around that, right? But just a little bit. If you're a worker in the informal sector, your real wage has been essentially flat, and the gap between the two has been getting wider. So slow growth of formal sector labor demand, a lot of workers who leave agriculture ending up in informal employment, and you know where they are. They're in various peripheral areas or interstitial areas of the economy, eking out a living doing whatever it is that they're doing in personal services or local transport and trade or construction, all of the other kinds of informal sector activities with which we're familiar. So let me now get to the meat of the talk, and that is really a story about education. Because we know that the most direct path from poverty to wealth is through education. If you're lucky enough to own a mine, that's great, but not many of us do that. Or maybe an oil palm plantation, but not many of us own those as well. For most of us, our labor is the primary source of our income. And the way to increase our income is to increase the productivity of our labor. And the way to do that is to be healthy and well-educated or well-trained, right? So we know that there's a huge premium on getting an education, that's going to be a strong predictor of higher earnings, as we'd expect. So let's now turn to that analysis and see what's going on. The labor market has changed in the ways that I've described. Sectoral changes for new market entrants, changes in the degree of formality going along with that. And so when we want to understand what implications that has for the returns to education, should I stay in school, should I go to college, or should I just get a job? Then we take the information available about the labor market and we plug it into Mincer earnings regressions, and we see what explains the growth of earnings for the average worker. So the standard Mincer regression looks like this. On the left-hand, on the left-hand side we have the log of earnings over here, and on the right-hand side we have a measure of schooling, and then we also have a vector of other variables that includes your labor market experience, your tenure in the labor market, sex, family characteristics, your origins, which will be important, where you live, and also your ex-post decisions about which job and which sector you take. So this is the standard Mincer earnings regression. And
this model is still exists, is it? Because this study has been done in 1960.
1974 is the original Mincer regression. The literature on using this model is vast. Vast. It's huge. There have been many refinements to this model and many amendments to it, but the basic model is very, very robust. Yeah, yeah. It's kind of good like that, right?
It's already obsolete.
It's like me. It's old, but it's not obsolete. I'm older than the Mincer model. Now, in our case, we're particularly interested in some special characteristics of this model. We want to know about the influence of formal employment on wages, and we want to know about the interaction of formality with education. If you have a better education, do you have a better chance of increasing your earnings by getting a job in the formal sector of the economy where earnings are higher, where wages are higher, as you just saw? And we also want to know whether there are cohort effects. That is, whether we can compare what's happening now in the late 2000s with what happened in the pre-crisis years and learn something by that. So that's where I'm going to go here. Now, we have a great data set in the IFLS, but of course there are issues. I'm going to use an OLS approach, and we know that there are selection issues because there's selection into employment, and if we don't account for that, then we have potentially biased results. Luckily, lots of other studies have looked at this as well, using Indonesian data and IFLS data, and haven't found any strong evidence of bias. So we're going to rely on those and lots of right-hand side variables and hope that our OLS approach is robust. We'll do some robustness checks just to see whether it really is or not. And then we have the problem of ability. Ability is unobservable, your cognitive ability and also your non-cognitive ability. These are things that we don't measure accurately or directly in labor market surveys like the IFLS, but we have some proxies for those. And in particular, we know that early childhood, actually prenatal and immediate postnatal experience, up to about age 2 or 3, is one of the most important determinants of cognitive and non-cognitive ability for adult workers. And we know this from a very large literature initiated by Janet Curry, the Princeton economist, and then continued by people like Christina Paxson and Case and others. All of these studies are studies which say the best, when we look at adults, one of the best proxies that we can find for non-cognitive and cognitive ability is adult height, because adult height is very strongly influenced by health and nutrition in early childhood. So if you have a good start in life, that is prenatal and first 2 years of life associated with good health and good nutrition, then you'll be a taller adult, and that height difference relative to the average is also a very good explanatory variable or a very good proxy for abilities that we can't observe directly in the data. There's a huge literature on this, which I'd be very happy to talk about as well. Actually, these days, economists are going into neuroscience to find the kind of evidence that supports this, the use of this proxy. So they're looking at brain development, not only gray matter, the active part of the brain, but also relative rates of development of different parts of the brain. And they're relating those to early childhood circumstances, and they find exactly the same thing. So our measure of adult height is going to be our proxy for cognitive and non-cognitive abilities, and that's going to link the current generation of workers back to their parents and forward to their children. That's going to be an important part of this story when we look at cohort effects. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the data, and then I'll show you some earnings regressions, and then I'll start to wind up. So the data, as I said, are from the Indonesian Family Life Survey. Probably most of you are quite familiar with these data already. It's a fairly strongly nationally representative data set. It was conducted in 4 waves. The 5th wave is now underway. Is that right, Nasib? Yeah, so now being conducted. We look forward to that. It gathers data on individuals, but also on the communities that they come from, and on their households, and it follows them very, very carefully. So there's a very low attrition rate in these data. It's actually, by world standards, this is a fantastic data set. It's a world-class data set because it follows individuals and households so assiduously, so carefully, that it has a very low attrition rate, only about 10% over the full range of the data, which is really pretty spectacular. We're going to use the data on working age individuals who report being in the labor force. So that's going to be the subsample of the IFLS that we use. And we're going to focus on the 2007 data, but we're also going to dip back to look at some cohort comparisons from the pre-crisis round of 1997. And the variables that we're going to pull out of the data set are as follows. We're going to look at earnings, of course. We're going to look at hours worked as well. And then education, tenure in the job, experience, whether you live in an urban or rural area, the region of the country that you live in, adult height, some family asset measures, that is, parents' education, mother or father, but we use the mother, the assets of your parents' household, whether they're wealthy or not, and then whether you're in formal employment or not, this very important variable, and then the interaction of whether you're in formal employment times your education, because we think that there's going to be action in the earnings function in there as well. So that's the very quick outline of the data. The paper itself summarizes the data. I'm sorry, I don't have a summary of the variables to show you here. But let's fit this earnings regression, the one that I showed you back here, with all of those variables on the right-hand side, and see what it tells us about the average earnings capacity of workers. So here is a number of different models. The first column, we use only education. So we say, in the first column, we restrict the earnings regression only to the education of the individual, and we find that the return, that is the marginal gain to an additional year of education, is around about 10%, 0.1. Very significant, of course. That's I guess a baseline regression of earnings on just education. As we increase the number of right-hand side variables, you're going to see that number coming down because we'll account for the returns to education directly in terms of a number of other assets of each of the individuals. So, for example, in the second column, you see that when we include participation in the formal economy, that accounts for a very large part of earnings differentials. So around about a 15% premium just from being in the formal sector economy. And when we interact formality with education, we get another bump as well. So we know that in terms of the earnings of workers, if you can get a good education or more education, you're going to earn more, no surprise. If you can use your education to get a formal sector job, you do even better still. Okay, what about the things that you inherit from your family? Well, I mentioned that the log of adult height, this one in here, is an important proxy for early childhood experience that has to do with the development of cognitive and non-cognitive abilities. And indeed, we see in here that's a very strong variable as well. So a small difference in height accounts for a very large difference in earnings. This is across all occupations. I should say, yeah, it's across all occupations and across all sectors. And there's something wrong with this table because we have controls everywhere through here. I'm sorry, I had to back up a moment. I don't know why, but some stuff has dropped out of here. These controls are included everywhere, all the way across. So we're looking at earnings conditional on choice of sector and choice of occupation in every regression. So we see that your origins in terms of cognitive and non-cognitive ability, also important. When we include parental assets, the education of your mother or your father, the wealth of the household, these three things are very highly correlated, as you might expect, but jointly they have about the same magnitude of effect on earnings. So jumping forwards to the last couple of columns here, when we include ex post decisions about education, about sector of employment, and about occupational choice, we find that the average returns to education, conditional on informal employment, about 4% per year. If you have formal employment, then you get an extra bump up to about 7% per year, roughly speaking, 7 or 8% per year. So there's a big premium for being in a formal sector job. There's a big premium on staying in school if you can, if the opportunity cost is not too high. So I think no big surprises here, right? The data are giving us back the kinds of numbers that we should expect. That is, the returns to education are positive, not as high as in many other countries, but comparable with many other studies of the Indonesian economy. Family origins, whether you had a good start in life, matter a great deal. So there's a lot of intergenerational transmission of opportunities in the labor market from parents to children. And that shows up in adult height of workers and also in the assets of the parents' household and the education of the parents. And then finally, participation in formal sector jobs is a very important predictor of higher earnings as well. Any questions about these results? Okay. Now, that is using the definition of formality, which I described as 1/4. That is the more conservative definition of formality. In the handout that you've got and in the paper, we also discuss the 2/3 formality data. The results are essentially very similar. They differ in predictable ways, so no need to go into detail with the discussion of that, I think. It's very similar kinds of results, and where they are different in understandable ways, given the difference in the definition of formality. So let's ignore those for today.
But one
Go ahead.
is regarding to the R squares, the very much so, it said, I mean, this is from my point of view, it said that this kind of contribution of this all variable was very much significant regarding to the earnings.
Well,
even though in terms of the significance is very much significant.
In this literature, I think an R squared of about 0.3, 0.4, 0.5 is typical.
Oh,
Yeah. When you think of all of the things that we're not accounting for in these data. So we have data on observable characteristics, and we have proxies for some unobservable characteristics, but we're still missing a lot of information about the individual worker. So there's got to be a lot of noise around the mean function that we're estimating here.
This does not mean that about 60% was the other variables. There was not.
Yes, that's correct. So the R squared is telling us about 60% of variation in the dependent variable is unexplained by the data that we have here. That's correct. Yeah, I think I'm not troubled by that. I think it's reasonable. If we were to slice and dice these data and use a lot more information, if we had more information, we might be able to improve that explanatory power, but I don't think we would improve our economic effects. It would be a statistical improvement, but not an economic improvement, if you know what I mean. Yeah. So here's what I think we can learn from these earnings functions. They provide us, this is just the 2007 data, so they provide us first of all with a snapshot of earnings patterns for the current Indonesian economy, or that of 2007 anyway. They show us that in the 1/4 model, the conservative definition of formal employment, that formal sector employment is associated with an earnings premium of 15 to 20%, depends on the model. The premium is much larger in the other model, the one with a more generous definition of formality, but as I said, so as to save time, let's not talk about that now. Returns to skills in informal employment are not that high. They range from about 4 to about 7% per year of schooling. That's on the low side for Indonesia. It's on the low side for international standards as well. Yeah, international norms say returns to schooling should be somewhere in the 8 to 10% range in a country like Indonesia. So it's a little bit low, and it turns out that it's diminished over time since the pre-crisis years. If you're in formal sector employment, returns to skills are much higher, that is, returns to education, 8 to 10% depending on the model. So when we put this information together with what we know about the change in the structure of labor demand, here are some things that we might be willing to say. First of all, we know that the change in the structure of labor demand in the Indonesian economy has been associated with a decline in the growth rate of manufacturing relative to non-tradables and low-skill activities, lower real wages, or rather no growth in real wages, lower rewards for educational investments. That is, for the typical school leaver in 2007, looking at the labor market and comparing what they see with what somebody would have seen in 1997, they're going, what's the probability that I'll get a job that will actually reward more education? Well, it's a lot lower than it used to be. That means, given that schooling is costly and that I'm giving up the opportunity to earn, maybe I shouldn't stay in school any longer. Or maybe I shouldn't progress from middle school, from junior high to high school. Maybe I shouldn't progress from high school to college. At the margin, it's becoming less valuable to do so because the structure of employment has moved away from skill-intensive activities that reward education. Another conclusion that we might draw is that the effects of inherited characteristics, family wealth and early childhood conditions, are persistent. So there's an intergenerational transmission of opportunities, or looking at it the other way, intergenerational transmission of poverty in the Indonesian economy as well, and it's quite strong. That is, the effect on earnings of a good start in life is very, very large. And then finally, we know that for those who are moving into informal employment, not only do they earn less, not only do they have less secure jobs, but they're also far more subject to macroeconomic volatility. Because when the economy experiences a negative shock, then the first set of industries to collapse are non-traded industries, construction, and then discretionary spending on services like restaurants, domestic tourism, things like that. So we know that those are industries where volatility is a very big issue compared with tradable industries whose prices don't vary all that much. So for the modal worker entering the labor force in 2007, things don't look as good as they do for the economy as a whole. Okay. I want to take a few minutes now and look at cohort effects, that is, to compare, to ask, is this different now from before, or is it just, this is the condition of the Indonesian economy? It's going to turn out it's different. So we're going to do this by looking at cohorts in the labor force. I showed you some data earlier that said that at the level of economic sectors, there isn't much churning of employment. People tend to stay in the same job pretty much all their lives. But young workers at the extensive margin of employment, that's where we see big changes in the structure of labor demand. That was those data that we saw much earlier. So if we focus just on the younger cohorts, then we get a sense of what is the future for Indonesian labor demand and also demand for education. So we divide the data into 3 cohorts. You can see the numbers up there. And then we rerun the earnings equations that I just showed you with cohort-specific intercepts and interactions with education and formality and the other key variables. I won't show you all of the regressions there in the paper as well, but what we're going to do with these data is we're going to compare cohort effects in 2007 with those in 1997, the end of a decade of very rapid growth in manufacturing and tradable sector activity in the Indonesian economy. And here are our main findings. First of all, when we compare 2000 with 2007 with 1997, we find that the earnings of old and young cohort workers are about the same, but the earnings of the middle cohort, those who in 2007 are aged 29 to 40, are quite a bit lower in real terms in 2007 than they were in 1997. Now, if you are 29 to 40 in 2007, then you were 19 to 30 in 1997. That means you were a young labor market entrant at that time, and you were joining the labor market right before the big crash. Okay? So I think that what we see in these data is evidence of a persistent effect on the workers who joined the labor market just before or during the Asian financial crisis. They just haven't recovered, even a decade later, in terms of earnings. There's a big gap in earnings for the middle-aged, the middle cohort of workers here. That's something I'd like to explore further, but for now I'll just put it out there. Second thing that we're going to see is that for the youngest cohort of workers, those who are relatively junior members of the labor force, in 2007 their returns to schooling are far lower than for other workers and lower than they were in 1997. And that is true whether they're in formal employment or informal employment. And this is a big surprise because we don't see any difference across cohorts or across formal and informal in the 1997 data at all. So this, I think, is a very troubling sign. If it's robust, if it's true, then this is a very troubling piece of evidence that tells us something about the labor market prospects for young Indonesians entering the labor force in the late 2000s. Here's a set of numbers that give us a summary of the comparison. First of all, if you look at the bottom line down here, when we fit the earnings regressions for 1997 data, we find no significant difference when we allow for different rates of return to education or rates of return to formal or informal employment. We don't find any differences, formal or informal, or by cohort with education across all of the data. So we only have one number down here for 1997 returns to education, and it's 9%, 7%, depending on which model we choose. The first is our model, the second is the Newhouse and Suryadharma definition of formality. So looking at the first numbers, around about 9% returns to skills in 1997. And we compare that with the numbers in the top two panels up here. If you're employed in the formal part of the labor force in 2007, and you are in the older cohorts, then returns to education are very similar, around about 10% per year of education. But if you're a young worker, then they're quite a bit lower, even in formal sector employment, about 7%. And now, remember that at the margin, the new workers are going not into formal employment, but into informal employment. So what's happening to returns to education for those workers? Well, up here, the middle and the older cohorts, the returns to their education, even given that they are in informal employment, they're modest but not terrible. But for informal sector workers, they're pretty low, under 4%. Okay? And if we compare this model and that model, and we think that the truth is somewhere between, if we think that our definition of formality is too conservative and the other is too generous and the truth is somewhere in between, then for young workers in informal employment, returns to education have got to be very, very low indeed. So now I'm 16 years old, I'm in high school, or I'm thinking about what to do next. Will I get a job? Will I stay in school? If I knew these numbers, I wouldn't stay in school. Right? That's the message that these data are giving us. And that's very different from back here in 1997. I would have said, for sure I'll stay in school. 9% rate of return on another year of schooling, that's fine, I can do that. But a 3% or a 2% rate of return on schooling, I can't do that. I can't afford to stay in school. So we have a situation in Indonesia where the government has devoted a tremendous effort, fiscal effort and policy effort, to increasing the supply of education. More schools, more teachers, more facilities. So they're shifting out the supply of education as fast as they can. But the changing structure of the macroeconomy, as reflected in the labor force, looks like it's not pushing out the demand for education and may even be causing it to contract, thereby offsetting some of the effects of the increased educational supply. And this is a worry, I think, for Indonesia. Okay, let me wind up. 3 more slides. Here's the provocative question that I began posing today, and I want to see what kinds of conclusions are safe to draw. First of all, we know that the panel data don't show a lot of changes in the structure of labor demand over time. There's been a slight decline in the returns to schooling for all ages, but people don't change jobs that much. Once they get into the labor force, they tend to stay in the sector and occupation that they joined. But when we compare across cohorts, we see a much clearer picture. We see a picture in which young workers in 1997 had a high probability of a job in manufacturing, the technologically dynamic sector that rewards education. Now, the higher probability is that they'll work in lower skill, lower technology sectors that don't reward education, and the returns to education have fallen accordingly, especially for those who don't expect to get a formal sector job. Typical service sector job is not formal. So these are the sectors where the greatest labor demand growth at the margin is taking place in Indonesia. So we have lower expectations or lower expectations for non-farm workers of formal employment, relatively low incentives to stay in school. Of course, the quality of schooling and the cost of schooling remain very big issues for Indonesia, but that's where the focus of government policy is. We're much more interested in what's happening on the demand side. And then we also, I think, can safely conclude that there's a lot of intergenerational inheritance of characteristics that predispose workers to good or bad outcomes in the labor market. So family origins matter a great deal. Early childhood matters a great deal, and matters not both because it increases your chances of getting education and also of using that education productively by getting a job in the right occupation, the right sector, and in a formal labor contract. So inequality may be exacerbated by the changes that we see taking place in the Indonesian labor force. Those who don't have a very good start in life are likely to have very few incentives to stay in school, therefore their labor will not be that productive and they'll end up in low-wage jobs. Those who have a good start in life will have a much better chance of getting a good job and high earnings. And so we can see the potential for bifurcation in the labor market, and maybe this is one source of the increase in the Gini coefficient for the economy as a whole. Okay, and we care about this because on the one hand, you know, the Indonesian economy is growing pretty fast. It's not like this is an economy in crisis or anything like that, but we also know that resource booms don't last forever. Indonesia has plenty of experience with this. However, their effects might. And we see that perhaps in the experience of the middle generation from 1997, much lower earnings in 2007. That could repeat itself again with the current generation. They're going into the labor force with few skills. They're not getting very good jobs. If there's a big economic downturn or even a small reduction in the rate of growth of the Indonesian economy, there are a lot of vulnerable workers out there. A lot of people who might be just above the poverty line now because they're working in urban services and not in agriculture, but with a little bit of a downturn in economic growth, they could find themselves below the poverty line once again. Yeah. Okay, now let's give equal time to a couple of other possibilities. One other way in which we lower the return to education is by greatly increasing the number of skilled workers or the number of educated workers. We push out supply and price goes down. That's a typical story in many countries. I don't think it applies in Indonesia. There just hasn't been that much growth in the supply of educated workers relative to the labor force as a whole. There have been a lot of new and often labor-saving technologies adopted in Indonesia, in transportation, in telecoms, all these mobile phones, right? In retail and other areas. So the employment elasticity of output might have dropped a great deal, and that's another kind of structural change that merits closer investigation. And then there's a whole slew of policy stories, policies regarding the labor market, about the credit market, about trade policy and FDI, and of course the huge one, the gorilla in the China shop, the fuel subsidy policies as well. All of these things threaten the rate of growth and the rate of structural change, and in particular the dynamism of manufacturing sectors in the Indonesian economy. So there's lots of policy stories to be explored here. Now, why are things not going better than they are? I mean, things are going well, but couldn't they be going better? I think we agree that they could. Well, one possibility is democratization. Indonesia's democracy is fantastic. It's vibrant, it's dynamic, it's unbelievably robust. Only a decade into the transition away from a very different form of government. But of course, Indonesia's governance system now is prone to coalitions, and coalitions are compromises. And those compromises tend to undermine good policy, right? And then the other thing is what I'm calling here the inverse of Sadli's law. Sadli's law is famous in Indonesia. Sadli's law is bad times make for good policy, right? But then you have a decade of good times, resource export revenues coming in at a pretty high clip. So maybe there's an inverse Sadli's law that says the good times allow governments to be a little bit slack about policy, not to make the hard decisions, and therefore to allow things to slide a little bit where they could be more efficient, they could be promoting a more rapid rate of growth and structural change in the economy. And I put these up because the next steps for this research involve a kind of a horse race between some of these competing explanations for changes in the demand for labor and demand for education with the story that I've told you. So let me conclude by saying what I think needs to be done now. First of all, we need to understand much more about occupational choices. Do I become an accountant or a sales clerk? If I'm in services, that is, I have lots of choices. Do I become a blue-collar production worker, or do I try to become a manager in a factory? Do I become a taxi driver or a construction worker? So occupational choices obviously have a great deal to do with labor market outcomes, and we need to really understand those better. We know that individual origins, what you inherit from your parents and your early childhood, are very important in occupational choices, determinants of those. We know that that also passes through educational choices, what school you go to, how long you stay in school. But we also want to know what are the effects of macroeconomic shocks that change the structure of labor demand on occupational choices. So I'm doing some multinomial logic at the moment, trying to understand better the choice of occupation by workers in the 2007 IFLS data. And I'll tell you all about that next time I come to visit you. Here's where I think some really interesting work could be done. In the IFLS, we have a great data set on individuals and their origins and their families and their labor market decisions. It's a fabulous data set. We now have the opportunity to match that with a lot of other fabulous data recently put online by the World Bank, the so-called Indo-Dapur data set, which has regional data, provincial data, even kabupaten level data on a lot of important economic variables. So we know that Indonesia is regionally a very diverse country. So maybe we can exploit some regional variation in things like price changes, changes in labor demand, changes in the structure of employment, and so on, to really identify much more accurately the motivations for staying in school, progressing from school to college, or joining the labor market, and occupational choices associated with joining the labor market. So our goal there would be to get deeper insights about the interactions of policies like education policy, infrastructure policy, or changes in the structure of labor demand on the decisions made by individuals as they enter the labor force and therefore determine the welfare of the next generation of Indonesians. That's what I have to say. I've spoken much too long. I apologize for that. I welcome your questions. Thank you.
So we will have our discussions. Perhaps there's 1, 2, or 3 questions first. Yeah. Please mention your name and institutions.
Thank you, Ian. That's really insightful presentation. Now, my name is Purna Gunawan Wawan from TNP2AK or Pajajaran University in Bandung. I have maybe one question and maybe one things to go to look ahead. First is that for the height that you use as a proxy for for a proxy for the abilities, right? It seems that the effect is diminishing when you put the non-educations and the assets. Maybe I don't know whether it shows that this proxy actually can be replaced by other variables, just like the mother education and log assets. Because if you want to use this kind of regulation for SUSNAS data or SACNAS data, we don't have this aid.
That's correct.
Right, so we can do that. And it seems that it doesn't really matters in Indonesia for this hate. I don't know whether it showed something like that. It doesn't show that, or it doesn't have really a strong relation between hate and also the ability. That's one thing that I want you to clarify. And then the other things that we have in Indonesia is compare 97 and then 2007 is the changes in the minimum wages law. Right. So that's might create a big differences between regions, especially in Java. And as I know that most of the IFLS data is concentrated in Java, right? It's only in 13 provinces.
13 and 26,
and the big variations, especially in the district minimum wages, is in Java. And it might also affect the probability of younger people so that to go into the labor market because the minimum wages is higher. And we can see that in some area the minimum wage increase is high. So it will induce more younger workers into the labor force. So that's my 2 comments and questions. Thank you.
Thanks. 2 really insightful comments. The minimum wage law, I need to learn much more about that. I should say the IFLS is the claim for the IFLS is that it's nationally representative. It concentrates on Java because most people live in Java, right? But your observation that the minimum wage laws bite more in Java is an interesting one, and that can have more than one effect, right? So higher minimum wages would induce young people to leave school sooner if they can get a job. But of course we know from recent data that youth unemployment in Indonesia is high and rising very fast. Around about 20% of school leavers unemployed at the moment.
But that's mostly for the high education.
Yes, it is concentrated towards higher education, that's right. So more work to do there. Now about the height, these regressions show us one thing, which is that height by itself is very significant. When you bring in other aspects of inherited characteristics, then the significance of height goes away. These things are all correlated, right? The overall effect remains of about the same magnitude. And while I can't show you the data here, let me add one thing to that. And that is, when we do these estimations are across all sectors, all occupations. If we break this out by occupation, so we look at professional and managerial and blue-collar workers and farm workers and sales workers and service workers like that, then we find the following very interesting phenomenon. And that is that height, conditional on education and everything else, height hasn't got any effect in any of those occupational earnings equations except one, and that is the services occupations. Okay? So in all of the others, height doesn't matter. By the time you get into that occupation, you're being rewarded for your education and you're being rewarded for other choices that you made along the way. And so it doesn't matter if you've got greater or lesser cognitive ability. The sorting has already been done. But in services, where informality is very high, height is super important. In fact, the most important determinant of variation in earnings. That's partly because services is a very heterogeneous category, but it's also because within services, where career tracks are not so well defined, then the returns to ability become very, very important, right? If you don't have a very good start in life, you end up selling vegetables and basically you're pinned down in a poverty trap. But if you have a reasonably good start in life, even if you find yourself in a low-skilled service sector employment, you have some opportunities to move up. And height, I think, is picking up that kind of individual variation in a very unstructured sector of occupational sector. So that's a result that I want to explore more. Doesn't show up in the aggregate data when we control for all those things, but when we break it out different ways, we see some very big effects.
Yes.
Yeah, now that I'm holding the speaker, I'm asked question. I am Asep from SMERU. I have one comment and one question.
Sure.
My comment is on your this model estimations, the heart of your study. I'm wondering with the main independent variable, the education's variable, which is the years of schooling.
Yeah.
Because it means you generalize all education levels down from the primary up to the university education. So I wonder if in reality the return to education is not linear, but it may be
Convex.
going up and quite steep.
Yeah.
So for example, if you replace your education variable with several dummy variables representing the level of education, primary, secondary, junior high, and university, we may have different conclusions. If we have low returns at the lower level of education and very high return at the university education, for example, then if I were a 16-year-old, my conclusion is not to jump out of school and getting a job. Rather, I would want to go to the university so I can get a very high level of salary when I graduated. That's my comment.
Sure.
My question is related to your earlier statement that in Indonesia we have seen raising labor costs but stagnant real wages. How do you reconcile this? Well, in other words, where does the money go?
Okay.
Thank you.
So the first question is a very good one, and a standard robustness checks for earnings equations of this type. We've run those checks, putting in, as you say, dummy variables for different levels of completion of primary school, junior high, high school, and so on. And the results indeed are nonlinear, just exactly as you say. They don't change the overall numbers that much because the majority of Indonesian students finish school somewhere around the age of 15, around that time. And so they're right, that's where the mass of the distribution is, and that's where the returns look just like this. Of course, if you stay on to complete high school or college, then the returns per year of additional education are indeed much higher. So are the costs. so is the opportunity cost. And then there's a big question in there about the trend towards vocational education, something that I've read a little bit about but don't fully understand yet. That the Indonesian government has been, I guess, pushing students into vocational high schools rather than general high schools. And the data that I've seen so far suggests that the returns to vocational high schools are quite low compared with general high schools. But I don't know enough about that to say confidently that that's the case as yet. So the non-linearity is very clear, but the basic story remains very similar to the one that you've seen today. As for the labor costs versus real wages, great question. I would like to know more about that too. I think that the result of tightening labor market regulations is what's to blame here. So we've got, for example, tightened rules on hiring and firing. For formal sector employers, the cost of taking on a permanent worker has gone up, I understand, has gone up quite considerably. But it's not reflected in wages, at least not in real wages. So that says that the implicit or explicit payroll tax has gone up. And I think that's where we should be looking for the wedge getting bigger.
Or dead weight loss?
I'm sorry? Or dead weight loss,
Dead weight
yes.
loss?
Yeah, so when I say explicit or implicit payroll tax, I'm thinking about that. So you could raise payroll taxes and that would give the result that we see in the data. But even if you don't raise payroll taxes, if you impose other regulations or policies which have the effect of making it more expensive to make a commitment to a formal sector job as an employer, then it's as if you raise the payroll tax. That would be a dead weight loss. Or yeah, I guess a dead weight loss, yeah.
So is there any questions? Okay.
Yes, thank you very much and congratulations, yeah, for your excellent presentation. But seems to me got so many information that you can share with us. I'm thinking that if I'm becoming the next coming president, 2014, I think there's so many things to be done. One thing that I think it's quite, for me, it's quite heroic findings. Yeah, when you are saying that. From basis from your finding, it seems to me that the trade sectors, non-tradable sectors in particular, is very dangerous for the government in order to be continued. In other words, the policy implication for the labor employment or labor creation needs to be emphasis on the, what do you call it, tradable sectors, especially in order to face the crisis. I think that's one thing that I note from your presentation. And the second one, regarding the Gini ratio that you have already been pointed out, that there has been a very significant increase since 2000 till this year, and then from 0.3 to 0.41. And then you, from your study, it seems to me that you mentioned that education, early childhood education is quite critical. And however, on the other side, you also mentioned the wealth of the family. I was wondering, in terms of the policy implication, because in order to minimize the Gini coefficient, the income inequality, there should be employment creation. So how can you, with these two, with this, what do you call it, the early childhood or family assets, and then what, wealth, how can, I cannot find any policy implication for the government in order to minimize this Gini problems. Thank you.
Wow, I can't solve so many problems for the Indonesian economy, but the emphasis on tradable sectors. So one thing that we know very clearly from international data, from panels of international development experience, is that the growth of the manufacturing sector is critical. And here, again, Danny Roderick is really just fabulous on this subject. He's got 2 or 3 recent papers that really take the data apart very carefully and put it back together and show us just how important manufacturing is. That is the technologically dynamic sector. When it grows, then it lifts labor productivity, and that in turn raises the returns to staying in school, which is the key for moving from poverty to non-poverty, right? So you can see the chain of causation there. If manufacturing is not vibrant, if it's not flourishing, then it's much more difficult to lift people out of poverty, even if aggregate income is growing. And I think that's partly what we see in Indonesia today. Aggregate income is growing, but manufacturing is not, and inequality is rising as a result, because the labor market prospects without the growth of manufacturing are not that great. Right? I guess on this subject, I would say that maybe there are several obvious policy implications. The number one policy implication, as far as I can tell, is to get rid of the fuel subsidies. 20% of the government budget gets spent on fuel subsidies. Tomorrow I'm going to the Ministry of Finance to tell them my opinion about this, but they already know this. That is that the fuel subsidies are a drain on opportunities. They crowd out opportunities for education, health, nutrition, housing, infrastructure, internal transport, all of those things. All of those things make labor more productive. Fuel subsidies don't. So I think there's a very clear policy implication there. If the Indonesian government, whatever it will be by next year, can find a way to systematically reduce and depoliticize fuel subsidies, for example, by announcing a 1% per month reduction or something like that and sticking to it, then they can create some fiscal space in which to undertake things that raise the productivity of Indonesian workers. That's the biggest policy implication that I can see, and that applies to your second point as well.
No, I mean,
yeah.
in terms of the policy employment creation,
sure.
Because
yeah.
you mentioned, I think your findings seems to suggest that the non-tradable sectors need to be minimized as an opportunity for
yeah.
so I think that's something that's quite big issue that I don't think Indonesia can be happy about that one. I can understand that tradable sector is quite critical, but when you are trying to differ between one and another, I don't think it's quite comparable.
It's not. I think it's not so much a matter of minimizing non-tradable sectors as it is maximizing the growth of sectors in which Indonesia has comparative advantage or could develop it in the future, and most especially of manufacturing. When we look at international data on the share of manufacturing in GDP, and we compare that with GDP growth, we see that Indonesia starts low, rises fast in the 1980s and 1990s, and then goes boom, like that, a long time before it should. And so I think that's the really critical part. It's not about making non-tradable smaller, it's about making manufacturing bigger. You know, we talk these days about electronics and machinery and transport equipment being made in the world, right? You know, parts and components come from everywhere and get assembled and sent to markets. But Indonesia is not a participant, not a meaningful participant in that made-in-the-world production network. And it needs to be. Yeah. As far as inherited wealth and the rise in the Gini and what kind of policy implications are there, I think there are some very clear policy implications. If you invest in early childhood health and nutrition, and if you invest in things that create educational opportunities and labor mobility, then you can break the intergenerational transmission of poverty. That is, if you give children a better opportunity than their parents would otherwise be able to give them, to become healthy, to be well-fed, and to have good schooling, then the transmission across generations of economic conditions is much weaker. I think that's the critical thing. Yes. Yes, that's right. So I work with demographers at the University of Wisconsin. Demographers are great people, so smart, right? I mean, they're like sociologists with economics training. I love working with them, and I can say that to economists, right? So, but what I learned from demographers is that things that economists all bundle up into early childhood and say, oh, we can use adult height and proxy all of that stuff. They unpack all of that, and they find maternal age and sibling spacing and all of these kinds of things are really important for the welfare of children, right? If you have a lot of children all bunched up together, they just don't get enough nutrition when you're poor, right? If you space them and you have fewer children, then each individual child has a much better start in life, other things equal. So these are the things that I can learn from demographers. So that's about family planning. It's about availability of early childhood and prenatal and postnatal care. It's all of those kinds of things which sound very basic and very simple, but in fact have a huge leverage on the quality of early childhood health and nutrition. I wish I knew more about this. I'd have to start life again to learn all these things carefully.
Hi, my name is Rika. I am a journalist before, but now I'm a student of Utrecht University. Related to the previous question about about the manufacturer, but I want to ask about the in another position as in the services sectors.
Yeah.
I think you explained it with quite a little bit gloom about this in these services sectors, but do you think is it possible to see different scenarios such as improving or enhancing these service sectors? Because in terms of comparative advantage, if we can talk about it, we really have this strength in these services sectors right now. For example, in the so-called internet economy that Indonesia is quite booming right now in terms of the telecommunication, IT, the internet, and then the social media, so on. And these services sectors, I think it could create like formal jobs. Do you think is it possible for the government or for us, for Indonesians, to enhance the services sector so we can create more formal jobs?
Sure, good question. Thank you. Yeah, so services is a very big category and very, very heterogeneous. So it's very, let's say, brave for anyone to say this is true about services, because we can always find exceptions within that. And the range, I mean, services is everything from selling vegetables to trading in stocks, right? So lots of things in between. Long run, we know that the service industries, especially skill-intensive services, that's where rich countries go, right? So we know that in the very long run, that should be the path that a country like Indonesia also follows. The question is, what is the transition from here to there, right? Technology and the cost of doing business, that's good for everybody. We can all do internet searches and find suppliers or markets and things like that. That's great. Get price information. But while that reduces some frictional costs in economic activity, the direct job creation may not be all that great. So the majority of jobs are still in much more mundane kinds of services activities. The kind that we see out here on Cikini Raya. Now, as Indonesia makes the transition from mostly resource-based, mostly blue-collar, to mostly high-skill and mostly white-collar in the future. And about that, I'm not such an expert.
So your policy recommendations, if you ask to make, is still lifting up the manufacturers and agriculture sectors.
At this point, I think it's quite clear that that's the most appropriate thing for Indonesia to do. Not that they should neglect other sectors, but that neglecting manufacturing could be fatal.
We still have 15 minutes. Is there any questions?
If you have better things to do, you can leave as well. I have nothing else to do. I'll stay.
I'm Vijayanti from SMERU. I have 3 points. The first is, in your first presentations, you show us that, Indonesia in general have a very low growth on manufacturing. But I don't know, I don't have the figure right now, but in the early 2000s, I have analyzed some of the regional data, subnational data in Indonesia, and you know that this is varies between regions, between provinces. At that times, I see that in the eastern part of Indonesia, the growth of manufacturing is almost none, and the economic growth is dominated by the growth on service sectors. But in East Java, the growth of manufacturing is still faster than the growth in. I don't know. I know that maybe with the IFLS data, it's not possible to look at by regions, but I don't know what will happen in the equations if you insert kind of dummy variables that looking at in which regions they live, whether it's in Java or other, and also look at these kind of factors. This is the first point. The second point is I'm wondering when the government is now have a lot of investment in education, the demand side, so the supply of human resources, but you know that the market for absorbing it is very limited. I don't know, maybe do you have any knowledge of other countries that have a similar patterns with Indonesia, and what will happen in the long run if you keep increasing your education level without tackling the real sectors for job absorption? And so it comes to the third point, which is because your policy recommendation still emphasizing more on the increasing the human capital. Since early childhood, and I know that this is important, but what will happen if now the emphasis now the emphasis is more on the problem is now more on the job creation, and I believe that sometimes the demand will be a response to the supply. If the demand for a higher quality of labor are there, then even not only governments but also the household, the family will also invest in their children. So I don't know. Which one should come first? What is the priority of the government should be? Do you have to create the labor market opportunity first, then allocate all the resources to the education?
Okay, thank you. Wow. Your first point was that there's subnational variation in the growth of manufacturing. That sounds very interesting to me. We have, in these regressions, we also use controls for region. They're not shown up here, but they exist. And so that's kind of swept out of the data, but not in a very, let me say, not in a very intelligent way. We just put in a dummy for Java, a dummy for Sumatra, a dummy for, and the remaining categories, the is everywhere else. So we don't have really good information, structural information about regional differences. But as I mentioned toward the end of my talk, I think that there is a huge opportunity to use regional data, which incorporates the kind of variation that you mentioned, to understand better what are the factors that influence children's decision to stay in school or to join the labor force. So I think I really look forward to working with those data and to learning more about that. I think that's very, very much on target for the next thing that has to be done. Second and third points were about, I think, about the tension between creating more jobs of any kind and creating more skilled workers, right? Yeah. I don't think any country in the developing world has ever paid a serious penalty for over-investing in education. When we look at the experience of Korea and Taiwan, so one generation before the Southeast Asian miracle economies, if you like, one thing that comes out very clearly is that those were economies which invested in education far before the demand existed for highly skilled workers. And as a consequence, as the economies matured and as wages began to rise, the skills existed to ensure that high wages were matched with high skills so that they could make the transition into high income. So the Korean case is exactly that. Korea invested in education in the 1960s and 70s when it was as poor as Indonesia. And furthermore, it made those investments in a very equal way. So there was almost no rural-urban gap in educational achievement in Korea, even though it was largely an agrarian economy at that time. That meant that as wages began to rise, as they must, then the productivity of labor rose to match the rise in wages. And the economy, instead of encountering a problem with high labor costs but low skills, was able to make a transition to high income. I think that's a big contrast with what we see in, say, Thailand. In the 1990s, Thailand had a boom in labor demand, and all the Thai high school kids aged 14, 15 walked out of school and into garment factories, footwear factories, things like that, right? And that was great, but then wages began to rise. Labor costs began to rise, and Thailand became much less competitive in the global market for simple manufacturers. And when that happened, the cost of labor went up, but the skill level had not risen along with that, and they had a crisis. So when you talk about the Asian financial crisis, in Thailand it was really a real crisis. The industries which contributed to the collapse were the most labor-intensive, low-skill industries. They're the ones that fell apart. And it's because rising labor costs hadn't been matched by investments in education. So no country has ever paid a real penalty for investing in education. I think that's the number one thing to remember. I think in the case of Indonesia, investing in education can't be a bad policy, but then those investments have to be matched by macroeconomic policies and sector policies, which also create opportunities for young workers, especially well-educated young workers, to have those investments rewarded. And I think that's where we see some tension in the economy right now. It's fixable, but there's clearly tension there. So the sectors that should be growing and should be absorbing relatively more educated workers aren't growing that fast. And because of that, we get a rise in unemployment, youth unemployment, especially concentrated among better educated youth. Their skills aren't matching the demand in the labor market. That's a macroeconomic issue that can be fixed, but it requires careful attention, I think. I hope that's helpful. I'm not sure.
What do you think about this? Because now, I mean, it means that, like in Indonesia, we have like more excess supply of educated youth.
Yeah.
Yeah. And how do you see like the Asian community, or I mean, more flexible mobility of labor across country will would it be, I mean, some things that Indonesia should also advocate, I mean, to let the international markets absorb, I mean, this excess supply?
Yeah, oh, that's a great question. No, I don't think so, but I do think that the counterpart could happen. That is, you can move the labor to where the capital is and make it more productive, or you can move the capital to where the labor is. That's much more frequently observed, right? Capital is far more mobile across borders than labor is, for all kinds of reasons. So then the question is, why isn't more capital coming to Indonesia to absorb those relatively skilled workers? Why is Indonesia not a part of the, obviously, a part of the global production networks that are lifting economies like Malaysia and Thailand and the Philippines through the growth in demand for manufacturing labor? That's really the big question, I think. So instead of thinking about Indonesian workers going to where the growth is, why isn't the growth coming here? And that's a question with a huge range of possible answers about macroeconomic policy, FDI policy, trade policy, logistics, all of those kinds of things. So, you know.
Do you think with the sorry, but do you think with the, like the political setting of it, and because you are also mentioned about our political setting could be the hindrance of the better macroeconomics policy, but would it be more difficult? I mean, given our existing political system to work on it, then just let them go. I mean, abroad.
I think everybody likes a democracy. Everybody loves a democracy, and democracies grow faster in the long run, right? So the long run prospects for Indonesia are improved by being the world's third largest democracy. What a great accomplishment that is! And when we compare Indonesia with Thailand, which could have been and has instead fallen apart politically, then I think, relatively speaking, Indonesia is in a better position. Other things equal, right? There are many other things that are not equal. Or the U.S. Yeah, the U.S. is also a democracy with serious problems. Yeah, long run, democracy will be fantastic for Indonesian economic growth. There's no question. But transitional, you know.
We just have to be patient.
You have to live a long time, Asif. I don't know. You know, what do we know about democracy and economic growth? All we have is extrapolations from cross-country data sets. It's not very helpful for an individual country. You know, there are so many things that are unique to each individual country that who knows. But the extrapolations point us in one direction. That's good.
Okay, is there any questions? We have 2 minutes.
Well, if not, let me thank you very much for... Let me thank you all very much and say, and reiterate something. Let me reiterate what I said at the beginning, which is that I know Indonesia primarily through the data that I look at. You live here, right? And so I come here to learn from you. If you have ideas or thoughts, if you look at the paper and think about it afterwards and want to say something, make a comment or a suggestion, I'm very open to that. You can find me on email and on the web very easily, and I really look forward to corresponding with you about that. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Before we close, I'm just curious about your recommendations about biodiversity.
Yeah.
I understand all from you. I'm a bit lost relating from your findings here to that policy recommendation. Can you tell me the link?
Okay. Well, I'll tell you a short version. So what does a fuel subsidy do? First of all, it promotes a fuel-intensive form of economic growth, and energy intensity and capital intensity are correlated. So there's a sort of a second order effect that says it slows down employment growth. What are the benefits of the fuel subsidy? Well, it lowers the cost of energy, and that promotes economic growth, and maybe it's good for cost of living stories. But I think those are small in relation to the big story. And the big story is that a fuel subsidy is an implicit tax on productive activity. How? Number one, the government finances the subsidy. 20% of the budget is spent on the fuel subsidy. So there is crowding out in the market for capital. That means capital costs for industry are higher because of government borrowing to cover the fuel subsidy. We all know that the Indonesian government's budget deficit is pushing out towards 3%. So there's a lot of borrowing going on there that is competing directly with industry. Second, the opportunity cost of the fuel subsidy is government spending on infrastructure, education, improving logistics, all of those kinds of things, which lower, and progress in all of those things lowers the cost of doing business. When you lower the cost of doing business, you increase employment. So I think the really direct ways in which the subsidy hurts Indonesians is because the subsidy is like an implicit tax on productive activity. And that tax outweighs the effects of lower energy costs. So that there's a net loss from that. And I think that's the most important channel that needs to be focused upon. If you could lower the subsidy in a systematic way, that is, if you could draw the political sting out of it, right? So that, because, you know, people protest not when you lower it by 1%, but when you say, we're going to make a big change, and there's a downturn in growth, so unemployment is rising, and we're going to change the subsidy in a big way, that's when people show up on the streets. But if you say, we have a 5-year program to eliminate the subsidy, it's going to come down by 1% a month or 0.5% a month, but it's going to be a program which doesn't change. Then I think you take out the political pain, you take out the cost of living shock that people experience, and then you give industry an opportunity to make investment plans accordingly. And I think that's really the critical thing that has to be done.
Okay, so let's end our interesting discussions. Let's give applause to Professor Ian.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks for coming. And also we have a lunch box, if you like to have a lunch. Yeah. Okay, thank you for